Oh, it's insane. And our insistence and dependence upon all these things. What are your thoughts, speaking of financial issues, of Bitcoin?
Well, Bitcoin is seen as a threat to the private central bankers, whose idea of an ideal society is where everybody has to borrow all currency from them at interest, even if the currency is just made up out of thin air. Mm-hmm. And they can't have anybody conducting commerce without using their banknotes borrowed at interest. And they're willing to use the law to enforce that. In fact, that's actually what triggered the American Revolution, was King George III's Currency Act, where King George told the colonies that they had to destroy their own locally produced currency and conduct all business and pay all taxes only with banknotes borrowed at interest from the Bank of England. Mm-hmm. And if you go back and you read the writings of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, this was the major driving force for the revolution, because it drove the colonies into the same utter poverty that you were seeing in the lower classes of England of the same day. Now, our public schools don't teach about this, because 100 years ago, when a corrupted Congress and a corrupted president sold us back into that same banker's slavery, all of a sudden the public schools were encouraged to sort of re-describe and reinvent the revolution as tea in Boston Harbor and lanterns and the church tower and Stamp Act and various other things. And that Currency Act vanished from the public school curriculum out of concern that some smart kid might stand up and say, wait a minute, we're back in that same exact system of being forced to conduct all business using banknotes borrowed at interest from private central banks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a real issue, and I can't imagine that they would allow Bitcoin to continue to keep growing like that. I mean, at some point, it's like with everything else, with marijuana, or I won't even call it marijuana, it should be called cannabis or hemp, because marijuana is a made-up term. But with these issues, they're either going to have to get on board and learn how to get creative and start taxing it and getting into the game, or they're going to have to completely ban it altogether, because you can't have something like, I mean, the internet itself, you and I having this conversation, and your radio show and your website, the ability for you to do what you do and get this information out there is not really beneficial for the government. And so I think the internet itself was an issue that, well, it is an issue because it's allowing information like this to get out. But with the idea of cannabis or podcasts like this, or having other issues like Bitcoin and things like that, they're going to have to figure something out because it's happening.
Well, they're trying to figure ways around all of these things, and I see a lot of parallels between how our current ruling elite are responding to the internet and the independent media with exactly how the ruling elite responded when Gutenberg rediscovered movable type printing and books became affordable to the middle class and literacy exploded and everybody started finding out things for themselves rather than sitting in the throne room or in the church being told what to think by the people in the fancy-looking robes. And it is provoking a social crisis, and that's why we've seen all these people out there saying the internet should have never been invented. And in point of fact, the internet was, when it was developed by ARPA, was never intended to be a public utility, because when DARPA first set it up, it was limited to military bases, military contractors, and universities that were carrying out research for the military.
And this was in the 60s, right?
This was in the 1960s.
Yeah.
And DARPA basically paid all the companies that were running the backbone servers. But as people left military contractors and universities and went to other jobs, they didn't want to give up email and FTP and UUCP and all those things they had back then, so they would just set up a connection to their computer at home. And the government started getting very nervous because all of a sudden there was this mass communications media emerging in the midst of the country that was not under control of the intelligence agencies the way the newspapers, radio stations, and TV stations were.